The vomit hit the tarmac with a wet splat that echoed across the flight line like a gunshot, and Captain Sarah Chen knew her career was over before it had truly begun. The other cadets stepped back in disgust, their pristine flight suits catching the harsh Nevada sun while Sarah's knees buckled against the scorching concrete. Above them, the F-22 Raptor's engines wound down with a mechanical whine that seemed to mock her failure, its sleek titanium hull still radiating heat waves that made the desert air dance. "Jesus Christ, Chen," barked Instructor Colonel Webb, his voice cutting through the morning air like shattered glass. "You haven't even left the ground yet and you're already painting the runway." His weathered face, mapped with 30 years of flight experience and disappointment, twisted into a grimace that Sarah had seen too many times before. The silver eagles on his collar caught the sunlight as he shook his head, and she could practically hear the career-ending report being typed in his mind. Sarah wiped her mouth with the back of her trembling hand, tasting bile and the metallic tang of humiliation. Her dark hair, regulation short but rebellious in its tendency to curl, was plastered to her forehead with sweat that had nothing to do with the desert heat. Around her, the other pilot candidates whispered behind cupped hands, their voices carrying on the dry wind like locusts. She caught fragments of their conversations. Motion sickness, washout, never should have been here in the first place. The irony wasn't lost on her that she stood on the very same tarmac where Chuck Yeager had once tested experimental aircraft, where legends were born and dreams either took flight or crashed spectacularly. Now, 23 years old with degrees in aerospace engineering and astrophysics, Sarah felt smaller than the dust motes swirling around her combat boots. Above them, the F-22 Raptor's engines wound down with a mechanical whine that seemed to mock her failure, its sleek titanium hull still radiating heat waves that made the desert air dance. Preparing and narrating this type of story takes a lot of time and effort. If you like the story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you want to watch every story of our channel, turn on the bell icon. "Jesus Christ, Chen," barked Instructor Colonel Webb, his voice cutting through the morning air like shattered glass. "You haven't even left the ground yet and you're already painting the runway." His weathered face, mapped with 30 years of flight experience and disappointment, twisted into a grimace that Sarah had seen too many times before. The silver eagles on his collar caught the sunlight as he shook his head, and she could practically hear the career-ending report being typed in his mind. Sarah wiped her mouth with the back of her trembling hand, tasting bile and the metallic tang of humiliation. Her dark hair, regulation short but rebellious in its tendency to curl, was plastered to her forehead with sweat that had nothing to do with the desert heat. Around her, the other pilot candidates whispered behind cupped hands, their voices carrying on the dry wind like locusts. She caught fragments of their conversations. Motion sickness, washout, never should have been here in the first place. The irony wasn't lost on her that she stood on the very same tarmac where Chuck Yeager had once tested experimental aircraft, where legends were born and dreams either took flight or crashed spectacularly. Now, 23 years old with degrees in aerospace engineering and astrophysics, Sarah felt smaller than the dust motes swirling around her combat boots. Above them, the F-22 Raptor's engines wound down with a mechanical whine that seemed to mock her failure, its sleek titanium hull still radiating heat waves that made the desert air dance. "Ma'am," ventured Cadet Rodriguez, his voice softer than the others. Tony Rodriguez had been her study partner through the academic phase, the only one who seemed to see past her frequent trips to the bathroom during centrifuge training. His brown eyes held genuine concern rather than judgment, and for a moment, Sarah felt a flicker of gratitude cut through her shame. "I'm fine," though her voice sounded like gravel scraped across concrete. The lie tasted worse than the vomit. She straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of her grandfather's pilot wings pinned inside her breast pocket, the silver wings that had carried him through 2 tours in Vietnam, the ones he'd pressed into her palm before his funeral 3 years ago, with whispered words, "Don't let them clip your wings, little bird." Colonel Webb's radio crackled to life, and Sarah caught the tail end of a transmission about weather conditions and training schedules. The everyday business of turning civilians into fighter pilots continued around her moment of crisis, indifferent to her personal catastrophe. She could see other aircraft in the distance, T-38 Talons lined up like silver arrows, and F-16 taxiing toward the active runway, contrails from high-altitude training missions scratching white lines across the impossibly blue sky. "Cadet Chen?" Colonel Webb's voice had taken on that particular tone that meant paperwork and medical reviews and the slow, bureaucratic death of dreams. "Report to flight medicine at 1400. We need to discuss your condition." The word condition fell between them like a lead weight. Sarah knew what it meant: vestibular dysfunction, spatial disorientation, the polite medical terms for a fighter pilot who couldn't handle the basic physics of flight. She thought of her mother's face when she'd called to say she'd been accepted into pilot training, the pride in her voice as she told the neighbors that her daughter was going to fly jets, maybe even become an astronaut someday. That conversation felt like it had happened in someone else's life. "Colonel," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength, "request permission to try again tomorrow." The words surprised even her. They seemed to come from some deeper place, some part of her that refused to accept defeat, even as her body betrayed her. Webb's eyebrows rose like twin question marks. Behind him, the other cadets had formed a loose semicircle, watching the drama unfold with the fascination of spectators at a car crash. Sarah could see Cadet Williamson trying to hide a smirk, her perfect blonde ponytail catching the breeze. Jennifer Williamson, daughter of a two-star general, granddaughter of a Medal of Honor recipient, born into the kind of military dynasty that made flight training look effortless. "Chen," Webb said slowly, "you just vomited before we even started engine run-up. You haven't been in a cockpit for 3 days without losing your lunch. What makes you think tomorrow will be different?" Sarah felt the heat rising from the tarmac through the soles of her boots, felt the weight of every eye upon her. In the distance, she could hear the distinctive whine of a centrifuge spinning up at the G-Force training facility, the machine that had become her nemesis over the past 2 weeks. That was where it had started, the crushing weight pressing down on her chest, the world spinning into gray-edged tunnel vision, the inevitable surrender to her body's rebellion against the forces that every fighter pilot had to master. "Because," she said, and her voice carried across the flight line with surprising clarity, "my grandfather flew 247 combat missions in Vietnam with an inner ear injury that should have grounded him permanently, because the first woman to fly in combat was told she'd never handle the stress. Because every time you think you've found my limit, I find a way to push past it." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant rumble of an aircraft taking off and the steady tick of cooling metal from the Raptor beside them. Webb's expression had shifted from dismissive irritation to something Sarah couldn't quite read. Skepticism mixed with a grudging curiosity, perhaps. "Your grandfather," Webb said finally, "was Lieutenant Colonel James Chen, wasn't he? Flew F-4 Phantoms out of Da Nang." Sarah's heart skipped. She hadn't mentioned her grandfather's name or rank. "Yes, sir." "You knew him?" "Knew of him. His squadron commander was my flight instructor at Williams AFB, back when I was younger than you are now." Webb's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Tom Bradley is to tell stories about a pilot who could thread an F-4 through a thunderstorm at night and come out the other side without a scratch. Said James Chen could feel things in an aircraft that other pilots couldn't even see." "Sir," interrupted Cadet Peterson from the back of the group. His voice carried the particular smugness of someone who'd never failed at anything important. "Shouldn't we be focusing on candidates who can actually, fly without decorating the aircraft?" A few nervous chuckles followed his comment, quickly stifled when Webb's gaze swung toward them like a searchlight. Sarah felt the heat rising from the tarmac through the soles of her boots, felt the weight of every eye upon her. In the distance, she could hear the distinctive whine of a centrifuge spinning up at the G-Force training facility, the machine that had become her nemesis over the past 2 weeks.
That was where it had started, the crushing weight pressing down on her chest, the world spinning into gray-edged tunnel vision, the inevitable surrender to her body's rebellion against the forces that every fighter pilot had to master. Peterson, when you've logged half the flight hours I have, maybe I'll start caring about your opinions on who should and shouldn't be flying. Until then, keep your mouth shut and your eyes open. The rebuke landed with surgical precision, and Peterson's face flushed red beneath his regulation haircut. Webb turned back to Sarah, his weathered features unreadable in the harsh desert light. Around them, the business of the flight line continued, ground crews performing pre-flight inspections, instructors reviewing flight plans, the constant background hum of jet engines that had become the soundtrack to her dreams and nightmares alike.
"Chen," he said finally, "you've got 48 hours. I want you to spend every free minute in the simulator. Work with flight medicine on whatever they can do for your situation, and show me something different than what I saw today. But understand this, I won't pass a pilot who can't handle the physical demands of combat flight, no matter whose granddaughter she is." The challenge hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down on ancient ground. Sarah could feel the weight of it settling on her shoulders, heavy as flight gear, but somehow lighter than the shame she'd been carrying. This wasn't the end, it was a reprieve, a chance to prove that the legacy flowing in her veins was more than just genetics and nostalgia. "Understood, sir," she replied, and for the first time that morning, her voice sounded like it belonged to a fighter pilot. As the group began to disperse, Sarah remained on the tarmac, looking up at the F-22 that had witnessed her humiliation. Its angular lines caught the sunlight like a sculpture of controlled violence, every surface designed for speed and lethality. She placed her palm against its warm titanium skin and whispered a promise that the desert wind carried away. "I'll be back." But even as she walked toward the medical facility, her legs still shaky and her uniform stained with failure, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The other cadets' laughter followed her across the tarmac, but it sounded different now, less like mockery and more like a challenge she was finally ready to accept. The question that would haunt her for the next 48 hours wasn't whether she could overcome her motion sickness. It was whether she was strong enough to become the pilot her grandfather had always believed she could be. Sarah's alarm buzzed at 0430, but she'd been awake for an hour already, staring at the ceiling of her dormitory room while her roommate, Cadet Martinez, slept peacefully in the adjacent bunk. The pre-dawn darkness felt heavy with possibility and dread in equal measure, and Sarah had spent those wakeful minutes cataloging every sensation in her body. The slight queasiness that had become her constant companion, the tension in her shoulders, the way her inner ear seemed to float independently of her skull whenever she moved too quickly. The dormitory was a monument to military efficiency. 2 narrow beds, 2 small desks, 2 regulation lockers, and barely enough room for 2 ambitious young women to coexist. Martinez was a helicopter pilot candidate, blessed with the kind of steady equilibrium that made her immune to motion sickness. Sarah had watched her roommates spin in desk chairs for fun, while she herself couldn't ride in the backseat of a car without feeling queasy. Sarah slipped out of bed as quietly as possible and padded to the small mirror mounted above their shared sink. The reflection that greeted her looked like a ghost of her former self. Dark circles under brown eyes that had once sparkled with unshakable confidence, skin pale despite the Nevada sun, and cheekbones more prominent now that stress had stolen her appetite. She touched the space above her breast pocket where her grandfather's wings rested, a ritual that had become as automatic as breathing. "You're up early again," Martinez whispered from her bunk, her voice soft with concern rather than complaint. "Did you sleep at all?" Sarah met her roommate's eyes in the mirror. Carmen Martinez had been her anchor through the worst days of training, the steady presence who brought ginger tea and held her hair back during the worst episodes of nausea. If Sarah was going to confide in anyone about the magnitude of what she was facing, it would be Carmen. "Maybe 2 hours," Sarah admitted, turning to face her friend. "Carmen, what if we can't do this? What if my body just wasn't designed for this kind of flying?" Carmen sat up in her bunk, her long black hair falling around her shoulders like a curtain. At 25, she was one of the older cadets, a former aerospace engineer who'd worked for Boeing before deciding she wanted to fly rather than just design aircraft. Her maturity had made her a natural confidant for the younger cadets struggling with the pressure. "My grandmother always told me that the body follows where the mind leads," Carmen said, swinging her legs over the side of her bunk. "But maybe your mind is fighting itself. Maybe part of you doesn't believe you belong here." The observation hit closer to home than Sarah cared to admit. She'd been the only woman in most of her engineering classes, the only minority in her advanced physics seminars, the only person who'd had to prove her right to exist in every room she'd ever entered. That constant state of proving herself had become so familiar that she barely noticed it anymore, until it became a liability. "I dreamed about flying before I could walk," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mom says I used to stand in my crib and spread my arms like wings. When other kids were playing with dolls, I was building paper airplanes and trying to understand why they flew. This isn't some backup plan or childhood whim. This is who I am." Carmen nodded, understanding. "Then maybe the question isn't whether you can do this, but how you're going to do this. Your body's rebelling against something. Figure out what that something is." Sarah's morning routine had become a carefully choreographed dance designed to minimize the triggers that sent her equilibrium spinning. She avoided sudden movements, kept her eyes fixed on stable reference points, and moved through her morning exercises with the deliberate precision of someone navigating a minefield. Her classmates bounded out of bed and rushed through their preparations. Sarah had learned to treat her body like a delicate instrument that required careful tuning. The dining hall was already buzzing with activity when she arrived at 05:30. Most pilot candidates ate breakfast with the enthusiasm of people who burned thousands of calories during high-intensity training. But Sarah had learned to stick to bland foods that wouldn't rebel during the day's activities. She selected plain oatmeal, dry toast, and weak tea, a far cry from the protein-heavy meals that fueled her classmates. "Chen!" The voice belonged to Cadet Morrison, a former Air Force Academy football player whose natural charisma made him a leader among the candidates. "Heard you got another chance with Webb. That's rare. He usually doesn't believe in second opportunities." Sarah looked up from her carefully arranged breakfast to find Morrison flanked by 3 other cadets, their expressions ranging from supportive to skeptical. This was the daily ritual she'd come to dread. The public discussion of her struggles, the well-meaning advice from people who'd never experienced her particular challenge, the weight of being a symbol rather than just another pilot candidate. "Yeah," she replied, keeping her voice neutral. 48 hours to show improvement." "Have you tried those motion sickness patches?" asked Cadet Thompson, a former Navy SEAL whose own transition to aviation had been remarkably smooth. "My sister swears by them for cruise ships." Sarah had tried everything: patches, medications, acupressure bands, dietary changes, meditation, even hypnotherapy during her weekend leave. Each solution had offered hope, followed by crushing disappointment when it failed to address the core problem. The worst part was the well-meaning suggestions that implied the solution was simple if only she were smart enough or motivated enough to find it. "I've tried most things," she said diplomatically, working with flight medicine on a few more options. Her grandfather's stories had shaped her understanding of what it meant to be a pilot. He'd described flying as a conversation between human intuition and mechanical precision, a dance where the pilot became an extension of the aircraft rather than its master. But Sarah's relationship with aircraft felt more like a battle, her body rejecting the very sensations that should have felt like coming home.
After breakfast, Sarah made her way to the academic building, where she had an hour of free study time before her first simulator session. The hallways were lined with photographs of distinguished graduates, fighter aces, test pilots, astronauts, general officers who'd shaped military aviation. She paused before a photograph of Colonel Eileen Collins, the first woman to command a space shuttle mission, and tried to imagine what battle she'd fought to earn her place among the stars. The study room was empty except for the ever-present hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of aircraft engines. Sarah opened her aerodynamics textbook, but found herself staring at the equations without processing their meaning. The mathematics of flight had always been her refuge, the precise relationships between lift and drag, the elegant physics of how air moved over a wing, the calculable forces that transformed theoretical possibility into soaring reality.
But knowing the math wasn't enough. She could calculate the exact g-forces generated during a 9g turn, could predict how those forces would affect human physiology, could even design countermeasures to minimize their impact. What she couldn't do was convince her own body to accept those forces as natural and manageable rather than as an assault to be resisted. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Thinking of you today, sweetheart. Dad says to remember that the strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire. Love you." The message brought tears to her eyes. Her parents' unwavering faith in her success sometimes felt like additional pressure, but today it felt like a lifeline. Sarah's father had been a welder before becoming a high school shop teacher, and his metaphors always involved metal and heat and the transformation that came from enduring stress. Her mother was a nurse who'd worked emergency rooms for 20 years, who understood better than most that the human body was capable of adapting to extraordinary circumstances given enough time and patience. They'd never doubted her decision to pursue flying, even when the costs had mounted. The expensive preparatory courses, the lost income during training, the emotional toll of watching their daughter struggle with something that had seemed so natural to her grandfather. Their support felt like a sacred trust that Sarah was terrified of betraying. The simulator bay was a temple of technology, filled with multi-million-dollar machines designed to replicate every aspect of flight without leaving the ground. Sarah had logged dozens of hours in various simulators, from basic trainers that taught instrument flying to advanced systems that could replicate combat scenarios with startling realism. In the simulator, she was competent, even gifted. Her engineering background gave her intuitive understanding of aircraft systems that impressed instructors. But simulators, no matter how sophisticated, couldn't perfectly replicate the vestibular challenges of actual flight. They could spin and pitch and roll, could subject her to g-forces that pressed her into her seat or lifted her against her harness, but they couldn't capture the subtle cues that her inner ear interpreted as threats. In the simulator, she was a pilot. In actual aircraft, she was a patient struggling with a medical condition. "Jen, you're in Bay 3 today," called Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the senior NCO who supervised simulator operations. He was a former crew chief who'd spent 20 years maintaining aircraft before transitioning to training operations, and his practical wisdom often cut through the theoretical complexity that confused younger cadets. "Sergeant," Sarah said as she approached her assigned simulator, "can I ask you something?" Rodriguez looked up from his checklist, his weathered face showing the patience that came from dealing with thousands of nervous pilot candidates. "Shoot. Have you ever seen anyone overcome serious motion sickness? I mean, really overcome it, not just manage it?" Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Had a student about 10 years ago, Air Force brat who'd been around planes his whole life but couldn't handle the real thing. Turned out he was psyching himself out, so worried about getting sick that he made himself sick. Took him 3 extra months to graduate, but he's flying F-35s now." "What changed?" "He stopped fighting the sensations and started accepting them.
stopped treating his body like the enemy and started treating it like part of the aircraft. Not sure if that helps, but maybe worth thinking about. Sarah climbed into the simulator cockpit. The familiar ritual of strapping in and running through pre-flight checks provided a measure of comfort. The cockpit was an exact replica of an F-22, every switch and display positioned exactly where it would be in the actual aircraft. She'd memorized every detail, could run through emergency procedures blindfolded, could calculate fuel consumption and weapons loads with mathematical precision. The simulation began with a routine training sortie. Takeoff, navigation to a training area, basic air-to-air intercept scenarios, then return to base. Sarah's performance was flawless, her responses crisp and professional, her decision-making sound. For 45 minutes, she was the pilot she had always dreamed of becoming. But when the simulation ended and she climbed out of the cockpit, the weight of reality settled back onto her shoulders. Excellence in simulation felt increasingly meaningless when she couldn't translate it to actual flight. She was becoming an expert at something that might forever remain theoretical. The rest of her morning was filled with ground school, weapon systems, threat recognition, tactical formations, all the academic knowledge that complemented hands-on flying skills. Sarah excelled in classroom settings, her engineering background allowing her to grasp complex concepts quickly. But intellectual understanding felt hollow when she couldn't apply it in the cockpit of a real aircraft. During the lunch break, she found herself drawn to the flight line, watching other cadets prepare for their afternoon sorties. The sight that had once filled her with excitement now brought a complex mix of longing and dread. She could see Cadet Williamson conducting her pre-flight inspection with the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in a cockpit, while Cadet Rodriguez ran through his checklist with methodical precision. Rough morning? The voice belonged to Captain Lisa Park, one of the flight instructors who'd been watching Sarah's struggles with particular interest. Park was a combat veteran with 2 deployments and a reputation for getting the best out of struggling students. Her approach was less confrontational than Webb's, but equally demanding. "The usual," Sarah replied, trying to keep the frustration out of her voice. Perfect in the simulator, disaster waiting to happen in real aircraft. Park nodded thoughtfully. "Walk with me," she said, leading Sarah toward a quieter section of the flight line. They stopped near an older T-38 trainer that was undergoing maintenance, its engine covers removed to expose the intricate machinery within. "See this aircraft? It's been flying for 40 years, trained thousands of pilots. But about 10 years ago, it developed a problem. Random engine fluctuations that only happened under very specific conditions. The engineers ran diagnostics, replaced components, tried everything they could think of. Nothing worked." Sarah waited, sensing there was more to the story. Finally, an old crew chief suggested they stop trying to fix the problem and start understanding it. Turned out, the engine fluctuations were actually the aircraft's way of compensating for a subtle aerodynamic issue. Once they worked with the aircraft's natural responses instead of fighting them, the problems stopped. The metaphor was clear, but Sarah wasn't sure she understood its application. "Captain, are you suggesting I stop trying to fix my motion sickness?" "I'm suggesting you stop thinking of it as something broken that needs fixing. Your body is trying to tell you something. Maybe instead of silencing it, you should listen to what it's saying." The afternoon brought her most dreaded activity, centrifuge training. The massive machine squatted in its own building like a mechanical spider, its long arms capable of generating forces that would crush an unprepared human body. Sarah had failed 3 centrifuge sessions, each failure more demoralizing than the last. But today felt different. Instead of approaching the machine with dread and resistance, she tried to embrace Captain Park's advice.
She climbed into the gondola not as someone about to be tortured, but as someone about to have a conversation with forces that had challenged pilots for generations. The first few minutes were routine, gentle acceleration to build up G-forces gradually, her body settling into the familiar struggle against the crushing weight. But instead of fighting the sensations, she tried to observe them, to understand what her body was trying to communicate. At 4 Gs, she felt the familiar tunnel vision beginning. But instead of panicking, she breathed steadily and accepted the narrowing of her visual field as information rather than failure. At 6 Gs, the crushing weight on her chest felt like being embraced by the physics of flight itself. At 7 Gs, she felt something shift, not in her body, but in her relationship with the forces acting upon it. She made it to 8 Gs before the world went gray around the edges, but for the first time, the grayout felt manageable rather than terrifying. When the session ended and the forces slowly diminished, Sarah realized she wasn't nauseous. For the first time in weeks of training, her body had accepted high G-forces without rebellion. The technician monitoring her session looked surprised. "Chen, your physiological responses were completely different today. Heart rate stayed stable, no signs of distress. What did you do differently?" Sarah considered the question as she climbed out of the gondola on legs that felt surprisingly steady. "I stopped fighting," she said finally. "I stopped treating the G-forces like something that was happening to me and started thinking of them as something I was participating in." The realization carried her through the remainder of the afternoon with a lightness she hadn't felt in months. Maybe her motion sickness wasn't a character flaw or a medical condition that disqualified her from flying. Maybe it was her body's way of demanding a deeper understanding of what it meant to be a pilot. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Sarah looked at her grandfather's wings with new understanding. He'd always described flying as a partnership between pilot and aircraft, but she'd been approaching it as a conquest, a battle to be won through willpower and determination. Perhaps the key wasn't to overcome her body's responses, but to transform them into something useful. Tomorrow would bring her final chance to prove herself worthy of continuing in pilot training. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, Sarah Chen fell asleep without the weight of impending failure pressing down on her chest. The morning of Sarah's crucial flight test arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the Nevada desert look like the surface of an alien planet. She stood at her dormitory window at 0500, watching the first flights of the day streak across a sky so blue it seemed painted with liquid sapphire. Today would determine whether her dreams lived or died, whether months of struggle would culminate in vindication or devastating defeat. But as Sarah prepared for what might be her final flight as a pilot candidate, she had no way of knowing that her personal battle was about to become entangled with a much larger conflict, one that would expose the systemic prejudices that had haunted military aviation for decades. Her preparation ritual had evolved into a form of meditation. Sarah moved through her morning routine with deliberate precision, each action designed to center her mind and prepare her body for the challenges ahead. She'd spent the previous evening in conversation with her grandfather's memory, reading his flight logs and trying to understand how he'd overcome his own inner ear injury to become one of the most respected pilots of his generation. The answer, she had realized, lay not in the medical details, but in his philosophy of flight. James Chen had written in his personal journal, "The aircraft doesn't care about your fears or your doubts. It only responds to your intentions. If you approach it as an enemy to be conquered, it will fight you. If you approach it as a partner in an impossible dance, it will teach you to fly." Sarah arrived at the flight line 30 minutes early, using the extra time to conduct the most thorough pre-flight inspection of her career. Every rivet, every surface, every component received her careful attention. The T-38 trainer assigned to her was aircraft 688156, a veteran that had trained thousands of pilots over its 4-decade service life. Its white paint was dulled by sun and age, but its engines were perfectly maintained, its control surfaces responsive, its systems reliable. "Early bird catches the worm, Chen," or in this case,
Early bird gets to prove she belongs in the sky. Sarah accepted her helmet and survival vest with steady hands. The gear felt heavier than usual, weighted with the significance of what lay ahead. "Sergeant, you ever have doubts about whether you belonged around aircraft?" Rodriguez paused in his inspection of her equipment, his weathered face thoughtful. "Every damn day for the first 5 years. Kept waiting for someone to figure out that a kid from East LA had no business working on million-dollar jets. Then I realized something. The aircraft don't care where you come from or what you look like. They only care whether you can do the job." The words carried more weight than Rodriguez might have intended. Sarah had spent so much energy fighting the assumption that she didn't belong in military aviation that she'd forgotten the simple truth that aircraft responded only to competence, not demographics. At 0730, Colonel Webb appeared on the flight line with the punctuality of an atomic clock. His expression was unreadable, but Sarah detected something different in his demeanor, a sharpened attention that suggested today's flight would be more than just a routine evaluation. Behind him walked Captain Park and 2 other instructors Sarah didn't recognize, their presence adding an ominous formality to the proceedings. "Chen," Webb said without preamble, "today's flight profile has been modified. Instead of basic formation flying and navigation, you'll be conducting advanced tactical maneuvering. High-G turns, rapid altitude changes, combat-style scenarios. If you're going to be a fighter pilot, you need to prove you can handle fighter pilot missions." Sarah felt her stomach tighten, but not with nausea, with anticipation. This was the test she'd been preparing for her entire life, even if she hadn't realized it. "Understood, sir. What's the specific mission profile?" "You'll be flying with Captain Morrison as your lead. He'll take you through a series of advanced maneuvers designed to stress test your physical and mental responses. If you experience any motion sickness, any spatial disorientation, any indication that you can't handle the mission requirements, you'll be grounded permanently." Captain Morrison stepped forward, and Sarah immediately understood why Webb had chosen him for this flight. Morrison had the lean, predatory look of a combat veteran, with ice-blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance and demeanor. His flight suit was adorned with patches from multiple combat deployments, and his reputation as one of the most demanding instructors in the program preceded him like a warning. "Cadet Chen," Morrison said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "I've reviewed your training records. Impressive academic performance, excellent simulator scores, but consistent problems with motion tolerance. Today we find out if you're a pilot who occasionally gets airsick or someone with motion sickness who thinks she can be a pilot." The distinction was crucial and devastating. Sarah understood that Morrison had already categorized her as belonging to the latter group, that today's flight was less about evaluation than demonstration, proving to everyone present that some barriers couldn't be overcome through determination alone. "Sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system, "I'm ready for whatever profile you want to fly." Morrison's smile was sharp as broken glass. "We'll see about that." The briefing room was sterile and functional, its walls covered with charts and diagrams that reduced the poetry of flight to mathematical precision. Morrison laid out a mission profile that made Sarah's previous flight trains look like leisurely sightseeing tours. They would climb to 25,000 feet, conduct a series of high-G intercept maneuvers, perform defensive spiral dives, execute snap rolls and barrel rolls, then finish with simulated combat maneuvering at low altitude. "At any point during the flight," Morrison emphasized, "if you become incapacitated by motion sickness, you'll immediately turn control over to me and will return to base. Understood?" Sarah nodded, but she was barely listening. Her attention had shifted to a deeper level, to the conversation she was having with her grandfather's memory and her own understanding of what it meant to be ready for this moment. The fear was still there, but it felt different now. Not the paralyzing terror of anticipated failure,
but the sharp-edged excitement of someone about to discover what they were truly capable of. The walk to the aircraft felt like a procession toward judgment. Other cadets had gathered to watch, some offering encouragement, others wearing expressions of morbid curiosity. Sarah could see Cadet Williamson among the spectators, her perfect features arranged in a mask of sympathetic concern that couldn't quite hide her satisfaction at witnessing a potential washout. Chen, the voice belonged to Tony Rodriguez, who'd broken away from the group of observers. Hey, whatever happens up there, remember that you've already proven you belong here. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. The support meant more than Rodriguez could have known. Sarah had spent so much time fighting for acceptance that she'd forgotten she already had allies, people who'd witnessed her struggles and believed in her potential, regardless of the outcome of today's flight. But as she approached aircraft 68-8156, Sarah's attention was captured by a conversation taking place near the wing. Two senior officers she didn't recognize were speaking in low, urgent tones with Colonel Webb, their body language suggesting this was more than casual discussion. "Directive from Washington," she heard one of them saying. "Questions about standards and whether we're compromising safety for the sake of diversity." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. This wasn't just about her motion sickness. It was about whether women, minorities, or anyone who didn't fit the traditional fighter-pilot mold could truly handle the demands of combat aviation. Her failure today wouldn't just end her career. It would be used as evidence that the barriers protecting military aviation's traditional demographics were necessary and justified. Webb noticed her approach and quickly concluded his conversation, but not before Sarah caught the final exchange. "Make sure the evaluation is completely objective. No allowances, no second chances. If she can't hack it, that's the end of the discussion." The pressure that settled on Sarah's shoulders felt heavier than any G-force she'd experienced in the centrifuge. She wasn't just flying for herself anymore. She was carrying the dreams of every woman who'd ever been told she wasn't strong enough, every minority who'd been assumed incapable, every person who'd been judged by their demographics rather than their determination. Captain Morrison was already in the front seat of the T-38, his movements efficient and professional as he completed his portion of the pre-flight checks. Sarah climbed into the rear cockpit, the familiar ritual of strapping in taking on new significance. Every buckle, every connection, every switch position had to be perfect. There would be no margin for error today. "Chen, radio check." Morrison's voice crackled through her headset, the flat tone giving no indication of his thoughts about what lay ahead. "Loud and clear, Captain Morrison." Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the turbulence in her chest. "Tower, Viper 17, ready for taxi." "Tower, Viper 17, taxi runway 03, winds 040 at 15, altimeter 299er2. The taxi to the runway gave Sarah time to center herself, to find the quiet space in her mind where fear transformed into focus. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, but her hands were steady on the controls, her eyes tracking the aircraft's responses with the precision her grandfather had taught her to value above all else. As they lined up on the runway, Sarah caught sight of the observation tower where Webb and the other senior officers had gathered. She could see their silhouettes against the morning sun, anonymous figures who would determine her fate based on the next hour of flight. The weight of their scrutiny felt like gravity trying to pull her back to Earth before she'd even left the ground. "Tower, Viper 17 ready for takeoff?" "Viper 17 cleared for takeoff, contact departure on 254.3. Morrison advanced the throttles, and Sarah felt the familiar surge of acceleration that had once triggered immediate nausea. But today, instead of resistance, she felt anticipation. The T-38's twin engines spooled up with a rising whine that seemed to harmonize with her heartbeat, and she experienced something she'd never felt before, the aircraft's eagerness matching her own.
As they rotated and climbed away from the runway, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed in her relationship with flight. The sensations that had once overwhelmed her, the shifting pressures, the changing orientations, the subtle cues that indicated lift and thrust, and the 1,000 micro-adjustments of controlled flight now felt like a conversation she was finally equipped to join. "Chen, we're climbing to Angels 2-5 for the first series of maneuvers," Morrison announced. "How are you feeling?"
"Good, sir," Sarah replied, and was surprised to realize she meant it. The steady climb should have triggered at least mild nausea, but instead she felt alert and focused, her body adapting to the changing environment with an ease that seemed almost miraculous. At 25,000 feet, Morrison began the evaluation with a series of steep turns designed to generate forces that would challenge Sarah's equilibrium. The first turn built up to 4 Gs, pressing her deep into her seat, while the horizon tilted at impossible angles. Sarah breathed steadily, using the techniques she'd learned in the centrifuge, and felt her body accept the forces as natural rather than threatening. "Increasing to 6 Gs," Morrison announced, his voice clinical and detached. The world became heavier, but Sarah's vision remained clear, her responses sharp. She could feel the aircraft's control surfaces responding to Morrison's inputs, could sense the delicate balance between lift and gravity that kept them aloft despite the crushing forces trying to drive them earthward. 7 Gs, Morrison called out, and Sarah heard something different in his voice. Surprise, perhaps, or the beginning of respect. At 7 Gs, Sarah felt the familiar gray creeping in around the edges of her vision, but it felt manageable, like a tide she could ride, rather than a wave that would drown her. She tightened her abdominal muscles, controlled her breathing, and felt her gray out recede as her body adapted to the stress. "Chen, how copy?" Morrison's voice carried a sharpness that suggested he was testing more than just her physical responses. "Loud and clear, Captain," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the forces pressing down on her chest. "Ready for the next maneuver." What followed was 30 minutes of the most demanding flying Sarah had ever experienced. Morrison put the T-38 through maneuvers that would have seemed impossible in simulation. Rapid reversals that threw them from positive to negative Gs in seconds. Spiral dives that built up speed until the aircraft shook with barely controlled violence. Snap rolls that tumbled them through space with mechanical precision. Through it all, Sarah felt her body responding not with rebellion, but with adaptation. Her inner ear, which had betrayed her so many times before, seemed to have found its rhythm with the aircraft's movements. Her vision remained clear, her responses sharp, her mind focused on the constant stream of information flowing through her senses. "Descending to Angels 5 for low-level maneuvering," Morrison announced, and she could hear something new in his voice, professional respect mixed with what might have been amazement. The low-level portion of the flight was designed to simulate combat conditions, with rapid altitude changes and aggressive maneuvering at speeds that left little margin for error. Morrison flew the aircraft like it was an extension of his own body, threading between imaginary threats with the kind of precision that separated good pilots from great ones. "Your machine, Chen," Sarah said suddenly, the words carrying the weight of ultimate trust. "Show me a series of defensive maneuvers, building up to whatever G-force you can handle." Sarah felt her hands settle onto the controls with a certainty that surprised her. The T-38 responded to her touch like a familiar friend, its control surfaces translating her intentions into reality with mechanical perfection. She began with gentle turns, feeling the aircraft's responses, learning the particular characteristics of this specific machine. Then she began to push harder. The first high-G turn she executed on her own felt like a revelation. Instead of fighting the forces trying to crush her, she felt herself becoming part of them, her body and the aircraft moving together through space with a unity she'd never experienced before. The horizon spun around them like a kaleidoscope, but Sarah's inner ear tracked every movement. Her vision remained clear, her responses sharp, her mind focused on the constant stream of information flowing through her senses.
5 Gs, she called out, her voice confident. "Copy 5 Gs, Morrison replied, and there was no mistaking the approval in his tone. Sarah pressed harder, pulling the aircraft into a tighter turn, feeling the G-forces build like pressure in a diving chamber. 6 Gs, 7, 8. The world became heavy and distorted, but her body accepted the stress as natural, necessary, even exhilarating. 9 Gs, she announced, her voice strained but clear. Jesus Christ, Chen, Morrison muttered, forgetting his professional composure. How are you holding up back there? Sarah checked her responses, her vision, her spatial orientation. Everything felt solid, controlled, manageable. Good, sir. Requesting permission to try for 10. The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of rushing air and engine noise. 10 Gs was near the limit of human tolerance, the kind of force that could cause trained pilots to lose consciousness if they weren't perfectly prepared. Your call, Chen, Morrison said finally, but if you start to gray out, release immediately. Sarah pulled the aircraft into the tightest turn she'd ever attempted. The G-forces built like a rising tide, pressing her deep into her seat, making every movement an act of will. The horizon disappeared into a blur of brown earth and blue sky, but her hands remained steady, her breathing controlled, her mind clear. 10 Gs. The number appeared on her display like a badge of honor, proof that her body had finally learned to work with the aircraft rather than against it. She held the turn for 10 seconds, feeling the forces that had once overwhelmed her now flowing through her like electricity, connecting her to the machine in a way that transcended mere mechanical operation. 10 Gs for 10 seconds, she announced as she relaxed the turn and let the aircraft settle into straight and level flight. All systems normal, pilot responsive. The silence that followed was profound. Sarah could almost feel Morrison processing what he'd just witnessed, recalibrating his assumptions about what she was capable of achieving. Chen, Morrison said finally, his tone carrying a tone she'd never heard from any instructor before, something approaching awe. In 20 years of flying, I've never seen a pilot overcome motion sickness like that. What the hell happened up there? Sarah considered the question as they climbed back to altitude for the return to base. How could she explain that she'd stopped fighting her body and started listening to it? That she'd learned to treat the aircraft as a partner rather than a conquest? That her grandfather's ghost had somehow taught her to embrace the very sensations that had once defeated her? Sir, she said finally, I think I finally learned to fly. The approach and landing were textbook perfect, Sarah's newfound confidence translating into smooth, controlled inputs that brought them back to Earth with barely a whisper of contact. As they taxied back to the flight line, she could see the crowd of observers who had gathered to witness what many had expected to be her final flight as a pilot candidate. But instead of the sympathetic faces prepared to console a washout, Sarah saw expressions of amazement, confusion, and in some cases, disbelief. Colonel Webb stood at the front of the group, his weathered features arranged in an expression she couldn't quite read. Morrison shut down the engines and popped the canopy, the sudden quiet after an hour of flight creating a cathedral-like atmosphere around the aircraft. Sarah remained in her seat for a moment, savoring the sensation of having conquered not just her motion sickness, but her own limitations. Chen, Morrison said as they climbed out of the aircraft, I owe you an apology. I came into this flight convinced you were a washout, someone who'd been given too many chances already. What I witnessed up there, that was some of the finest high-G flying I've ever seen from a student pilot. The praise felt surreal, like something happening to someone else. Sarah had spent so many months anticipating failure that success felt foreign, almost dangerous to acknowledge.
Webb approached them as they completed their post-flight inspection, his expression unreadable. Behind him, the two senior officers Sarah had overheard earlier watched with obvious interest, their body language suggesting this outcome had not been what they'd expected. Well? Webb asked Morrison, though his eyes remained fixed on Sarah. Morrison's response was crisp and professional. Colonel, Cadet Chen successfully completed the entire mission profile without any signs of motion sickness or spatial disorientation. She demonstrated exceptional G tolerance, maintaining consciousness and control through 10 G maneuvers that would challenge experienced combat pilots. In my professional opinion, she's ready for advanced training. The words hung in the air like a verdict. But Sarah could see that Webb was struggling with something deeper than just her individual performance. The political implications of her success were clearly weighing on him. The knowledge that her achievement would be complicated the narrative that some in the Air Force preferred to maintain. 10 Gs? Webb asked, his voice carrying a note of skepticism. You're certain of that reading? Confirmed by aircraft instruments and my own observation, Morrison replied firmly. Colonel, I've never seen a transformation like what happened in that cockpit today. This young woman has overcome a significant obstacle through pure determination and skill. One of the senior officers stepped forward, his expression stern. Colonel Webb, I trust you'll be conducting a thorough review of today's flight data. We need to ensure that all evaluation standards were met without exception. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. Even in the face of undeniable success, there were those who remained committed to finding reasons for her to fail. The realization that her achievement would be subjected to extraordinary scrutiny felt like a violation, proof that some barriers were constructed not from necessity, but from prejudice. Sir, Sarah said, addressing the senior officer directly, if there are any questions about today's flight, I welcome whatever review you think is necessary. The aircraft's data systems recorded every moment of the mission. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he resented being addressed by someone he clearly considered presumptuous. Cadet, the review process isn't a matter for your input. Your job is to follow orders and meet standards, not to question evaluation procedures. The rebuke was designed to put her in her place, to remind her that success didn't grant her the right to challenge authority. But Sarah felt something shift inside her, a confidence born from having proven herself under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. Yes, sir, she replied, her voice carrying a new note of authority. I understand that meeting standards is my responsibility. Today, I exceeded them. The statement was simple, factual, and undeniably true. But in the context of institutional hierarchy and the political undercurrents that surrounded women in combat aviation, it felt like a declaration of war.
Colonel Webb presided over the session with obvious discomfort, clearly aware that what should have been a celebration of student achievement had become something far more complex and politically charged. The flight data was displayed on multiple screens around the room, every parameter of their mission documented with digital precision. Let's review the G-force readings, said Colonel Andrews, one of the senior officers who'd been observing from the tower. His voice carried the flat authority of someone accustomed to having his conclusions accepted without question. The aircraft systems show sustained forces of 9 to 10 Gs during the final maneuvering sequence. That's correct, sir, Morrison confirmed. I observed Cadet Chen maintain control and consciousness throughout the entire sequence. Her responses were appropriate, her communications clear, her aircraft handling textbook perfect. Andrews studied the data displays with the intensity of someone searching for flaws that would support his preconceptions. Captain Morrison, in your experience, what percentage of pilot candidates can handle 10G maneuvering on their first attempt at high-performance flight? Morrison's answer was immediate and unequivocal. Less than 5%, sir. What Cadet Chen accomplished today represents exceptional performance by any standard. And yet, Andrews continued, his tone suggesting he'd found the flaw he'd been seeking. This same cadet has been struggling with basic motion tolerance for weeks. How do you explain such a dramatic transformation? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah realized that her success was being treated not as an achievement, but as an anomaly that required explanation, possibly even suspicion. The implication was clear. Either her previous struggles had been exaggerated, or today's performance was somehow fraudulent.
Sir, Sarah said, knowing she was violating protocol by speaking without permission but unable to remain silent, "If I may address that question." Andrew's expression hardened. "Cadet, you'll speak when asked to speak." Colonel Webb intervened before the situation could escalate further. "Actually, I think it would be valuable to hear Cadet Chen's perspective on her performance today." Sarah stood, feeling the weight of every eye in the room upon her. These men held her future in their hands, but she'd learned something important during today's flight. She could no longer allow fear of their judgment to silence her voice. "Sirs," she began, her voice steadied despite the adrenaline coursing through her system, "my motion sickness was real, and it was debilitating. I'm not going to minimize or deny that. But what I learned today is that motion sickness, for me, was a symptom of trying to fight the aircraft instead of working with it." She paused, gathering her thoughts, aware that her next words might determine whether her career lived or died in this room. "My grandfather flew F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam with an inner ear injury that should have grounded him. But he learned to use his body's responses as information rather than treating them as obstacles. Today, I finally understood what he meant. Instead of fighting the G-forces, I learned to become part of them." Andrews leaned forward in his chair, his expression skeptical. "Cadet, are you suggesting that motion sickness can be overcome through willpower alone?" "No, sir," Sarah replied firmly. "I'm suggesting that some barriers are more mental than physical. I spent weeks treating my body like it was defective, when what I needed to do was learn to trust it." Another officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, spoke up from the back of the room. "Cadet Chen, your academic records show exceptional performance in aerospace engineering and physics. Do you believe your technical background gave you advantages in overcoming these physiological challenges?" The question felt like a lifeline, an opportunity to redirect the conversation toward her qualifications rather than her struggles. "Sir, understanding the physics of flight helped me intellectualize what I was experiencing. When I could calculate the forces acting on my body, they became predictable rather than overwhelming."
But understanding physics and handling 10 Gs in actual flight are very different things, Hayes continued. "What specifically changed for you today?" Sarah thought about Captain Park's story of the aircraft that had taught engineers to work with its natural responses rather than fighting them. "Sir, I stopped trying to control every sensation and started listening to what my body was telling me. Instead of fighting spatial disorientation, I learned to use it as information about the aircraft's attitude and energy state." The room fell silent as the officers processed her explanation. Sarah could see some faces reflecting consideration, others maintaining skepticism. But she also noticed something else, a few expressions that suggested her words were resonating with pilots who'd faced their own battles with the physical demands of flight. Captain Morrison stood to address the room. "Gentlemen, I've been instructing pilot candidates for 8 years. What I observed today wasn't just improved performance, it was a fundamental breakthrough in how a pilot relates to her aircraft. Cadet Chen didn't just overcome motion sickness. She discovered how to use her body's responses as flight instruments." "That's a very poetic interpretation, Captain," Andrews said dryly. "But our responsibility is to evaluate whether candidates can consistently perform under combat conditions. One good flight doesn't establish a pattern of reliability." The criticism stung because it contained an element of truth. Sarah had achieved something remarkable today, but she understood that proving herself once wasn't the same as proving she could repeat that performance under various conditions. "Sir," she said, "I request the opportunity to demonstrate consistency. Whatever additional testing you think is necessary, I'm ready to undertake it." Andrews studied her for a long moment, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Cadet, additional testing wasn't what I had in mind.
I was thinking more along the lines of medical review, perhaps psychological evaluation, to determine if your previous struggles indicate underlying issues that might resurface under stress. The suggestion hit Sarah like a physical blow. Medical review could keep her grounded for weeks or months, while bureaucrats decided whether her achievement was genuine or temporary. "With respect, sir," Morrison interjected, "Cadet Chen's performance today met or exceeded every standard we apply to pilot candidates. Subjecting her to additional evaluation based on past difficulties seems inconsistent with how we treat other students." Andrew's response was swift and cutting. "Captain, other students don't represent the potential precedent that Cadet Chen does. Her success or failure has implications beyond her individual career." The words confirmed Sarah's worst fears about the political context surrounding her training. She wasn't just being evaluated as a pilot candidate. She was being treated as a test case for whether women could handle the demands of fighter aviation. Her success threatened narratives that some in the Air Force were determined to preserve. Colonel Webb, who had remained silent during much of the exchange, finally spoke with the authority of his position and experience. "Gentlemen, I think we're overcomplicating this situation. Cadet Chen completed a demanding flight profile without any signs of the motion sickness that had previously affected her performance. Captain Morrison, one of our most experienced instructors, has certified that her performance met all standards for continuation in the program." He paused, looking around the room at the assembled officers. "Unless someone can point to a specific regulation or standard that she failed to meet today, I see no justification for additional testing beyond what we require of any other candidate." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken political calculations. Sarah could see the conflict between those who wanted to support her achievement and those who saw her success as threatening to institutional traditions they valued.
Lieutenant Colonel Hayes broke the silence with a question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Colonel Webb, are you confident that Cadet Chen can repeat today's performance under various conditions? Combat aviation requires absolute reliability, not occasional excellence." Webb's answer came without hesitation. "Sir, every pilot has to prove their reliability over time. What Cadet Chen demonstrated today is that she has the fundamental capability to handle high-performance aircraft. The rest will determine through continued training, just as we do with every other candidate." Andrews made one final attempt to derail Sarah's progress. "Colonel, I'm recommending that Cadet Chen be transferred to a non-fighter track. Transport or tanker aircraft might be more appropriate given her medical history." The suggestion was devastating in its implications. Transferred to a different aircraft track would mean abandoning her dream of becoming a fighter pilot while still technically remaining in aviation. It was a compromise designed to placate those who wanted her to fail while avoiding the appearance of outright discrimination. But before Webb could respond, Morrison stood again, his voice carrying a note of controlled anger that surprised everyone in the room. "Sir, with respect, that recommendation is inconsistent with merit-based evaluation. Cadet Chen just demonstrated G-tolerance that exceeds most fighter pilots. Transferring her based on past difficulties rather than current performance would be a waste of exceptional talent." The confrontation between Morrison and Andrews crackled with tension that went beyond Sarah's individual case. It represented a clash between old-school attitudes that viewed women in combat roles with suspicion and a newer generation of officers who believed in evaluation based purely on performance. Sarah realized that her moment had come, not just to defend her own achievements, but to speak for everyone who'd been told they didn't belong in the cockpit of a fighter aircraft. "Sirs," she said, her voice carrying a strength she hadn't known she possessed, "I understand the concerns about my reliability and the precedent my success might set. But I'd like to point out that every great pilot in Air Force history overcame obstacles that others thought were insurmountable." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of officers who held her fate in their hands. Chuck Yeager was told he didn't have the right education to be a test pilot. Robin Olds was considered too aggressive and insubordinate to succeed in a military career. My grandfather was medically disqualified from flying and chose to surf anyway, becoming one of the most decorated pilots of his generation. Today, I proved that I can handle anything you can throw at a fighter pilot. Not despite being a woman, not despite my previous struggles with motion sickness, but because I have the skills, the determination, and the heart of someone who belongs in a cockpit. The room fell silent, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Thoughtful rather than hostile. Contemplative rather than dismissive. Colonel Webb looked around the room one final time before rendering his decision. Gentlemen, based on today's flight performance and Captain Morrison's evaluation, Cadet Chen will continue in the fighter track. She'll be subject to the same evaluations and standards as every other candidate, nothing more and nothing less. The decision felt like a victory, but Sarah knew it was only the beginning. She'd won the right to continue pursuing her dreams, but she'd also made enemies who would be watching for any sign of weakness, any excuse to justify their belief that she didn't belong in a cockpit of a fighter aircraft. As the officers filed out of the conference room, Sarah remained behind with Morrison and Webb. The silence between them was comfortable, the silence of allies who'd shared a battle and emerged victorious. "Chen," Webb said finally, "today's flight was exceptional, but it's also painted a target on your back. There are people in this organization who will be looking for reasons to prove that today was a fluke."
Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. "Sir, I'm prepared for that. Today taught me something important. I don't have to be perfect to be worthy. I just have to be the best pilot I can be." Morrison smiled, the expression transforming his usually stern features. "That's exactly the right attitude. And Chen, what you did up there today wasn't just good flying. It was inspirational flying. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." As Sarah walked back to her dormitory that evening, she felt the weight of what she'd accomplished settling into her bones. She'd not only overcome her motion sickness, but had done so in a way that forced even her harshest critics to acknowledge her capability. But she also understood that her real test was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that today's achievement was the beginning of something lasting rather than an isolated moment of excellence. For the first time since arriving at pilot training, Sarah Chen fell asleep not as someone fighting to prove she belonged, but as a fighter pilot who'd earned her place in the sky. The weeks following Sarah's breakthrough flight passed in a blur of intensive training that felt like surfing the edge of a perpetual avalanche. Each day brought new challenges designed to test whether her transformation was genuine or temporary, and Sarah met each test with a confidence that surprised even herself. But as her performance continued to excel, she began to notice patterns that suggested her individual success was part of a much larger story, one that reached into the highest levels of military leadership and touched the lives of women across the entire aviation community. It started with small observations that might have seemed coincidental to someone less attuned to the undercurrents of institutional politics. Sarah noticed that her flight schedules were being monitored more closely than those of other cadets, that her performance data was being copied to recipients whose names she didn't recognize, that conversations stopped abruptly when she entered rooms where senior officers were present. The first concrete revelation came during a routine academic session on aircraft systems. Sarah was reviewing hydraulic schematics when her instructor, Major Patricia Blackwood, asked her to remain after class. Blackwood was one of only 3 female instructors in the entire training program, a combat veteran whose quiet competence had earned respect from even the most traditional officers. "Chen, I want to share something with you, but it has to stay between us for now." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the reflexive expectation of bad news that had become her default response to unexpected conversations with authority figures. "Yes, ma'am." Blackwood moved to the classroom door and closed it, her actions suggesting the conversation was more sensitive than a routine instructor-student discussion.
Your flight data from the past 3 weeks has been forwarded to the Pentagon, specifically to a working group that's been studying the integration of women into combat aviation roles. The information hit Sarah like a revelation and a violation simultaneously. Her struggles and achievements were being scrutinized not just locally, but at the highest levels of military leadership, turned into data points in a debate she'd never consented to join. "Ma'am," Sarah said carefully, "what kind of working group?" Blackwood's expression was grim as she explained. "There's been pressure from Congress to evaluate whether physical standards in pilot training are appropriate, whether they unfairly exclude qualified candidates. Your case, a woman who initially struggled with motion tolerance but then demonstrated exceptional G tolerance, represents exactly the kind of data they need to support changes in policy." I felt the familiar sensation of being reduced to a symbol rather than treated as an individual. "And if I don't want to be part of their study?" "That's not really an option," Blackwood said bluntly. "Your performance is being documented whether you participate willingly or not. But I thought you should know that your success is having implications far beyond your own career."
The conversation left Sarah with a complex mix of pride and resentment. She was gratified that her achievement was being recognized at the highest levels, but frustrated that her personal journey was being appropriated for political purposes she didn't fully understand. Over the following days, Sarah began to notice other female pilots and pilot candidates approaching her with stories that suggested her experience was part of a much larger pattern. Cadet Martinez confided that she'd been struggling with confidence issues after being told repeatedly that helicopter pilots needed different skills than real military aviators. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, from the previous training class, revealed that she'd been channeled toward transport aircraft despite requesting fighters, told that her natural communication skills made her better suited for multi-crew environments. Each conversation added another piece to a mosaic that Sarah was only beginning to understand. The barriers she'd faced weren't individual challenges, but systemic patterns that affected every woman who dared to pursue military aviation. Her success hadn't just overcome personal obstacles, it had demonstrated that many of those obstacles were artificially constructed rather than naturally inevitable. The most significant revelation came during a chance encounter in the base commissary. Sarah was selecting her usual bland dinner options when she was approached by Captain Jennifer Walsh, a pilot she'd never met who wore the distinctive patches of an F-16 squadron. "Excuse me," Walsh said, her voice carrying the particular tension of someone about to share dangerous information. "You're Cadet Chen, right? The one who's been making waves in pilot training?" Sarah's guard immediately went up. After weeks of scrutiny and political maneuvering, she'd learned to be suspicious of unexpected approaches from people she didn't know. "Yes, ma'am." Walsh looked around the commissary nervously before continuing. "I need to tell you something, but not here. Can we meet somewhere more private?" An hour later, Sarah found herself in Walsh's car in an empty parking lot outside the base, listening to a story that reframed everything she thought she understood about her training experience. 3 years ago, Walsh began, I was exactly where you are now, struggling with motion sickness, being told I wasn't physically suited for fighter aircraft, facing a review board that wanted to transfer me to a different track. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. What happened? I was lucky. My squadron commander believed in merit-based evaluation and fought for me to get additional training time. But here's what I learned later. There was an unofficial policy encouraging instructors to counsel out female candidates who showed any signs of struggling with the physical demands of flight. Unofficial policy? Sarah said slowly. Walsh nodded grimly. Nothing written down, nothing that could be traced back to specific individuals, just guidance that suggested female candidates required higher standards of evaluation because they represented unknown risks in combat situations. Sarah's mind raced through her training experience, reinterpreting conversations and interactions in light of this new information. The extra scrutiny,
the suggestions that she consider other career paths, the assumption that her motion sickness represented a fundamental incompatibility with military aviation. It all made sense now. "Captain," Sarah said slowly, "are you saying that my struggles were being used as justification for broader discrimination?" Walsh replied grimly, "I'm saying that your success is threatening to people who benefit from maintaining artificial barriers. And I'm warning you that the closer you get to graduation, the harder they're going to try to find reasons to stop you." The conversation continued for another hour, with Walsh sharing details about other female pilots who'd faced similar challenges. Some had persevered and gone on to successful careers, but others had been quietly encouraged to pursue different paths, their potential lost to an institution that valued conformity over capability.
As Sarah drove back to her dormitory that night, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She wasn't just pursuing her own dreams anymore, she was carrying the hopes of every woman who'd been told she didn't belong in a cockpit, every minority who'd been assumed incapable, every person who'd been judged by demographics rather than determination. The next morning brought a summons that confirmed her worst fears about the political implications of her success. Sarah was ordered to report to the office of Brigadier General Patricia Hammond, the base commander, for what was described as a courtesy meeting, but felt more like a command performance. General Hammond's office was a shrine to Air Force history, its walls lined with photographs of legendary aircraft and the pilots who'd flown them. Hammond herself was a petite woman whose presence filled the room with an authority that had nothing to do with physical stature and everything to do with earned respect. She was one of the first women to fly in combat, a trailblazer whose career had opened doors for the next generation of female aviators. "Cadet Chen," Hammond said without preamble, "please have a seat. We need to discuss your role in some important policy discussions." Sarah took the offered chair, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap with military precision. "Yes, ma'am." Hammond studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Your training performance has attracted attention at the highest levels of Air Force leadership. Your transformation from struggling with motion sickness to demonstrating exceptional G-tolerance has become a case study in how we evaluate pilot candidates." The general paused, her expression suggesting she was choosing her words carefully. "But I want you to understand something important. Your individual success is being used to support arguments on both sides of a very complex debate." Sarah felt confused. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand." Hammond leaned forward in her chair, her voice taking on the tone of someone sharing classified information. "There are those who see your achievement as proof that current evaluation standards are working properly, that qualified candidates eventually succeed regardless of initial struggles. But there are others who argue that your case demonstrates the need for different approaches to evaluating female candidates." The distinction was subtle but crucial. Sarah's success could be interpreted as validating existing systems or as evidence that those systems needed fundamental changes. "General," Sarah said carefully, "I just want to be the best pilot I can be. I didn't ask to become a political symbol." Hammond's expression softened slightly. "Neither did I when I was your age. But sometimes history chooses us rather than the other way around. The question is whether you're prepared to handle the responsibility that comes with being a symbol." Sarah considered the question, thinking about all the women who'd reached out to her with their own stories of struggle and perseverance. "Ma'am, if my success can help other qualified people get fair opportunities, then I'm willing to accept that responsibility." Hammond nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say, because I have something to share with you that will help you understand the broader context of what you've achieved." The general moved to her desk and retrieved a thick folder marked with classification stamps. "This is a comprehensive study of pilot training outcomes over the past decade, broken down by gender, ethnicity, and various other demographic factors." She opened the folder and spread several charts across her desk. What these data show is a pattern of differential evaluation that goes far beyond individual instructor bias. Female candidates are statistically more likely to be counseled out of fighter tracks, more likely to have their struggles attributed to fundamental limitations rather than training issues,
more likely to be subjected to additional scrutiny when they succeed.
Sarah studied the charts, her engineering background helping her interpret the statistical patterns. The data was damning. It showed systematic differences in how male and female candidates were evaluated and supported through training challenges. General, this suggests that institutional bias has been affecting pilot training outcomes for years. Exactly, Hammond confirmed. And your case represents a perfect example of what happens when a candidate is given genuine support rather than subtle discouragement. Your transformation wasn't just personal growth, it was the result of instructors like Morrison and Webb who evaluated you based on performance rather than preconceptions. The revelation reframed Sarah's entire training experience. Her struggles hadn't been unique, and her success hadn't been entirely individual. It was the product of finding mentors who believed in merit-based evaluation. "Ma'am," Sarah said, "what does this mean for other female candidates?" Hammond's answer was direct and transformative. "It means we're implementing policy changes based on your case and others like it. New guidance for instructor training, revised evaluation protocols, and most importantly, accountability measures to ensure that all candidates receive fair assessment." The implications were staggering. Sarah's personal journey from struggling cadet to successful pilot was being used to justify systemic changes that would affect generations of future aviators. But Hammond wasn't finished. "There's something else you need to know. Your performance data has been shared with NASA's Astronaut Selection Committee. They're specifically interested in candidates who've demonstrated the ability to overcome physiological challenges through adaptation and training." Sarah felt her breath catch. The possibility of becoming an astronaut had been a distant dream, something she had fantasized about but never seriously pursued. The idea that her struggles with motion sickness might actually qualify her for consideration was almost too incredible to process. "General, are you saying that NASA is interested in my candidacy?" "I'm saying that your ability to transform a physiological limitation into a strength represents exactly the kind of adaptability they value in astronaut candidates. The human body's response to spaceflight involves many of the same challenges you've learned to overcome." The conversation continued for another hour, with Hammond sharing details about policy changes, mentorship programs, and initiatives designed to ensure that Sarah's experience became a template for supporting struggling candidates rather than an isolated success story. As Sarah left the general's office, she felt the weight of her achievements settling into a new configuration. She wasn't just a pilot candidate anymore. She was a catalyst for institutional change, a living example of what became possible when barriers were removed and support was provided. The next few days brought a series of revelations that filled in the remaining pieces of the puzzle. Preparing and narrating this type of story takes a lot of time and effort. If you like the story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you want to watch every story of our channel, turn on the bell icon. Sarah learned that her flight data had been analyzed by aerospace medicine specialists who were studying the relationship between motion sickness and G-tolerance. Her case was being used to develop new training protocols that could help other pilots overcome similar challenges. She discovered that Captain Morrison had been quietly documenting cases of differential evaluation, building a database that supported arguments for policy reform. His support for her hadn't just been individual mentorship, it had been part of a broader effort to promote merit-based assessment. Most surprisingly, she learned that Colonel Webb had been fighting behind the scenes to protect her from the political pressures that threatened to derail her training. His gruff exterior had hidden a deep commitment to ensuring that qualified candidates succeeded regardless of their demographics or initial struggles. "Chen," Webb said during a private conversation, "I want you to understand something. When I first saw you vomiting on the tarmac, I thought you were going to wash out. Not because you were a woman, but because motion sickness has ended a lot of flying careers." Sarah listened as Webb continued. "But what I witnessed in your transformation taught me something important about the difference between physical limitations and training challenges. Your success didn't just prove that you could overcome obstacles,
It proved that our evaluation methods needed to be more sophisticated. The admission was profound, coming from an instructor whose reputation was built on uncompromising standards. "Sir, are you saying that my struggles actually contributed to improvements in the training program?" "I'm saying that your willingness to persist in the face of setbacks, combined with proper support and evaluation, created a model for how we should approach all struggling candidates. Male or female, minority or majority, everyone deserves the kind of thoughtful assessment you eventually received." As Sarah's training progressed toward graduation, she began receiving messages from female pilots and pilot candidates across the Air Force. Women she'd never met reached out to share their own stories and to thank her for demonstrating that persistence and proper support could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, an F-22 pilot, wrote, "Your success has given me ammunition to fight for better evaluation of female candidates in my squadron. Thank you for proving that excellence comes in many forms." Captain Ashley Johnson, a test pilot, sent a longer message. "I struggled with spatial disorientation during my initial training and was told it was a female problem that indicated I wasn't suited for high-performance aircraft. Your case is being used to develop new training methods that could have helped me years ago. You've changed how we think about pilot development." Each message reinforced Sarah's understanding that her individual achievement had become part of a larger movement toward more equitable and effective pilot training. Her motion sickness, once a source of shame and frustration, had become a catalyst for institutional change. The final revelation came during her last week of pilot training, in a conversation with a congressional aide who visited the base to gather information about training reforms. She learned that her case had been cited in congressional testimony about military readiness and the importance of maximizing the potential of all qualified candidates. "Ms. Chen," the aide explained, "your transformation from struggling cadet to exceptional pilot has become a powerful example of what's possible when we focus on developing talent rather than excluding it. Your story is helping to shape policy at the highest levels of government." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the scope of what her personal journey had unleashed. She'd entered pilot training hoping to fulfill a childhood dream and honor her grandfather's legacy. She was graduating as someone whose struggles and success had contributed to systemic changes that would affect thousands of future aviators. On the night before graduation, Sarah sat in her dormitory room holding her grandfather's pilot wings and reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the vomit-stained tarmac where her career had nearly ended before it began, about the centrifuge sessions that had taught her to embrace rather than fight the forces of flight, about the political battles that had raged around her individual achievement. Carmen Martinez found her there, staring out the window at the flight line where it had all begun. "Nervous about tomorrow?" Carmen asked. Sarah considered the question. Tomorrow would bring graduation ceremonies, the awarding of pilot wings, and the beginning of her journey toward becoming a combat aviator. But more than that, it would mark her transition from struggling cadet to trailblazer, from someone fighting for acceptance to someone whose success had opened doors for others. "Not nervous," Sarah said finally. "Grateful. Grateful for the chance to prove that barriers can be overcome, that institutions can change, that individual persistence can create opportunities for everyone who comes after." Carmen smiled, understanding the weight of what Sarah had accomplished. "Your grandfather would be proud." Sarah touched the silver wings in her pocket, feeling the connection across generations of pilots who'd pushed boundaries and challenged assumptions. "I think he'd be proud not just of my success, but of what that success has made possible for others." As graduation day dawned, with the kind of pristine clarity that had marked all the crucial moments of her training, Sarah Chen prepared to receive her pilot wings, with the knowledge that she'd earned them not just through individual effort, but by helping to transform the very system that had once seemed determined to exclude her. Her motion sickness had become a catalyst for institutional change.
Her struggles had illuminated systemic problems that affected countless other aviators. Her success had proven that with proper support and evaluation, barriers that seemed insurmountable could become stepping stones to excellence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she transitioned to fighter training, but tonight, Sarah fell asleep as someone who'd learned that the most important victories weren't just personal, they were the ones that made victory possible for everyone who followed. 6 months after receiving her pilot wings, Second Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood on the tarmac at Luke Air Force Base, watching the sun paint the Arizona desert in shades of copper and gold. Before her sat an F-35 Lightning II, its stealth coating gleaming like liquid obsidian in the morning light. Today marked the beginning of her fighter training, the next phase in a journey that had already transformed not just her own life, but the lives of countless others. The months since graduation had passed in a whirlwind of recognition and responsibility that Sarah was still learning to navigate. Her story had been featured in military publications, her training methodology had been incorporated into official curricula, and her case had been cited in congressional hearings about military readiness and inclusion. But more meaningful than any public recognition were the private messages from other pilots who'd benefited from the policy changes her experience had catalyzed. Lieutenant Chen called Major Diana Reeves, her new instructor and flight commander. "Ready to see what you can do in a real fighter?" Sarah turned from her contemplation of the aircraft to face Reeves, a combat veteran whose reputation as both a skilled pilot and an innovative instructor had preceded her. Reeves was part of a new generation of military leaders who'd embraced the data-driven approach to pilot development that Sarah's case had helped establish. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah applied, feeling the familiar surge of anticipation that came with each new aircraft, each new challenge. More than ready. The F-35 represented everything Sarah had dreamed of flying, a fifth-generation fighter that combines stealth, sensors, and weapon systems into the most advanced combat aircraft ever built. But more than its technological sophistication, the F-35 symbolized her arrival at the pinnacle of military aviation, the fulfillment of dreams that had once seemed impossible. As she conducted her pre-flight inspection, Sarah reflected on the changes that had swept through pilot training since her graduation. The motion sickness protocols she'd helped develop were now standard curriculum, taught to instructors across the Air Force. Female candidates were no longer subjected to the informal counseling out that had ended so many promising careers. Most importantly, the entire approach to evaluating struggling candidates had been reformed to focus on potential rather than immediate performance. "Sarah!" The voice belonged to Captain Tony Rodriguez, her former classmate who'd arrived at Luke Air Force Base the week before. His presence was a reminder of how far they'd both traveled from their days as uncertain cadets facing an institution that seemed designed to exclude them.
"Tony," Sarah said, embracing her friend with the casual affection of shared struggle and mutual respect. "How are you adapting to the F-35? Rodriguez's expression was animated with the enthusiasm of someone living his childhood dreams. "It's like flying a computer that happens to have wings. The situational awareness is incredible. You can see threats and targets that would have been invisible in older aircraft." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Colonel James Park, the squadron commander whose reputation for developing exceptional pilots had made him a sought-after leader throughout the Air Force. Park was Captain Lisa Park's husband, and his family's commitment to mentoring struggling pilots had become legendary in aviation circles. "Lieutenant Chen," Park said, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd watched her journey from a distance. "Welcome to the 61st Fighter Squadron. We're honored to have you here." The welcome felt both personal and institutional, recognition of her individual achievement, but also acknowledgement of her role in transforming how the Air Force developed its pilots. Sarah had learned to accept such recognition gracefully while remaining focused on the work that lay ahead. Sir, thank you for the opportunity. I know this squadron has a reputation for excellence, and I'm committed to upholding that standard. Park nodded approvingly. I have no doubt you will, but I also want you to know that your presence here represents more than just individual success. You're part of a new generation of pilots who prove that excellence comes from developing talent rather than excluding it. The words reminded Sarah of conversations with General Hammond about the broader implications of her success. Her case had become a cornerstone of Air Force personnel policy, cited in documents that would shape military aviation for decades to come. As the day progressed through briefings and initial familiarization flights, Sarah found herself part of a squadron culture that felt fundamentally different from the environment she'd experienced during basic pilot training. The focus was on collaborative learning rather than competitive elimination, on developing each pilot's unique strengths rather than enforcing rigid conformity. Her first flight in the F-35 was a revelation that justified every moment of struggle she'd endured to reach this point. The aircraft responded to her inputs with a precision that felt almost telepathic, its advanced systems amplifying her capabilities rather than demanding that she adapt to its limitations. Most remarkably, her motion tolerance was not just adequate, but exceptional. The lessons she'd learned about working with her body's responses rather than fighting them translated perfectly to the demands of fifth-generation fighter aviation. "Chen, your G tolerance is off the charts," Major Reeves reported during the post-flight debrief, "maintaining consciousness and control through 9G maneuvers like it's routine flying. What's your secret?" Sarah considered the question, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. "Ma'am, I learned that motion sickness taught me to listen to my body's signals more carefully than most pilots. Instead of ignoring physiological feedback, I use it as information about the aircraft's energy state and my own condition." The explanation sparked a discussion that lasted well into the evening, with other pilots sharing their own approaches to managing the physical demands of high-performance flight. Sarah realized that her former struggle had become an asset, giving her insights into human factors that enhanced her effectiveness as a combat aviator. Over the following weeks, Sarah's integration into the squadron proceeded with a smoothness that would have seemed impossible during her early days of pilot training. Her technical competence was beyond question, but more importantly, her approach to learning and problem-solving was creating new standards for how pilots could develop their skills. The squadron's approach to motion tolerance training had been revolutionized based on Sarah's experience. Instead of simply testing pilots' resistance to disorientation, instructors now taught candidates how to use vestibular responses as flight instruments. The result was a new generation of pilots whose visual awareness exceeded anything achieved through traditional training methods.
Lieutenant Chen, Lieutenant Colonel Park said during a private meeting, "I want to discuss your role in some initiatives that go beyond this squadron." Sarah felt the familiar tension that came with discussions of her symbolic importance. She'd learned to navigate the responsibility that came with being a trailblazer, but she sometimes missed the simplicity of being evaluated purely on her performance as a pilot. "Sir, I'm committed to whatever the Air Force needs for me." Park smiled, understanding her ambivalence about public roles. "This isn't about public relations or political symbolism. NASA has formally requested that you participate in their astronaut candidate evaluation program." The words hit Sarah like lightning. The possibility of space travel had always been a distant dream, something she'd fantasized about but never seriously pursued. The idea that her struggles with motion sickness might actually qualify her for astronaut consideration seemed almost too incredible to accept. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand how motion sickness qualifies someone for space travel." Park's explanation revealed the sophisticated thinking behind NASA's interest. Your ability to adapt to disorienting environments, to use physiological stress as information rather than distraction, represents exactly the kind of flexibility required for spaceflight. The human body's response to microgravity involves many of the same challenges you've learned to master. The conversation continued for an hour, with Park outlining NASA's interest in pilots who demonstrated exceptional adaptation to vestibular challenges. Sarah's case had caught their attention not despite her motion sickness, but because of how she'd transformed it into an asset. "Sir,
If NASA is serious about this opportunity, I'd be honored to participate in their evaluation process. Park nodded with obvious satisfaction. I hoped you'd say that. Your application has already been submitted, and you'll begin the evaluation process next month. As Sarah left Park's office, she felt the familiar sensation of her world expanding beyond what she'd thought possible. From struggling cadet to fighter pilot to potential astronaut, the trajectory seemed almost too dramatic to be real. But the most meaningful recognition came not from official channels, but from the letters and messages that continued to arrive from other pilots whose careers had been affected by the changes her experience had catalyzed. Captain Jennifer Walsh, the pilot who'd first warned her about institutional bias, wrote to share that she'd been selected for test pilot school, an opportunity that might not have been available without the policy reforms Sarah's case had supported. Lieutenant Maria Gonzalez, a current pilot candidate, sent a message that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "Ma'am, I want you to know that your story gave me the courage to persist when I was struggling with spatial disorientation. The new training protocols helped me overcome challenges that might have ended my career under the old system. Thank you for proving that barriers can become stepping stones." Each message reinforced Sarah's understanding that her individual journey had become part of something much larger than personal achievement. The squadron's first major exercise came 3 months into Sarah's assignment, a complex scenario that tested their ability to operate as an integrated combat unit. Sarah's role was to lead a 4-ship formation in a simulated air-to-air engagement against experienced adversary pilots flying aircraft designed to replicate enemy threats. The mission brief took place at 0400, with Sarah and her wingman reviewing intelligence data, weather conditions, and tactical considerations that would affect their performance. As the newest pilot in the formation, Sarah felt the weight of proving herself worthy of her teammates' trust. "Viper Lead, your formation looks solid. Remember, this exercise is designed to test your ability to adapt to changing conditions. Don't expect everything to go according to plan."
The warning proved prophetic. 20 minutes into the mission, Sarah's formation encountered a simulated surface-to-air missile threat that forced them to execute emergency defensive maneuvers while maintaining their primary mission of intercepting enemy aircraft. The situation demanded the kind of rapid decision-making and physiological tolerance that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. As Sarah pulled her F-35 into a 9G defensive turn, she felt the familiar sensation of gravitational forces pressing against her body. But instead of the nausea and disorientation that had once overwhelmed her, she felt only clarity and control. Her body's responses provided information about her aircraft's energy state, her position relative to threats, and the tactical situation developing around her. "Viper 2, bandit at your 3 o'clock high," she transmitted to her wingman, her voice calm despite the crushing forces acting on her body. "Copy, Viper Lead. Engaging." The engagement that followed lasted 12 minutes and involved maneuvers that pushed both pilots and aircraft to their limits. Sarah's formation successfully intercepted the adversary aircraft while avoiding simulated surface-to-air threats, demonstrating a level of tactical proficiency that impressed even experienced evaluators. "Viper Lead, outstanding mission execution," the exercise controller transmitted as they recovered to base. "Your formation's performance exceeded all expectations." But the praise that meant the most came from her wingmen, pilots whose respect had to be earned through demonstrated competence rather than granted through institutional mandate. "Sarah," said Captain Mark Stevens, her number 2, "that was some of the finest tactical flying I've ever seen. Your spatial awareness during those defensive maneuvers was incredible." Lieutenant Brad Morrison, her number 3, and Captain Morrison's younger brother, added his own assessment. "Ma'am, my brother told me about your transformation during pilot training, but seeing you work under pressure like that, you've set a new standard for what exceptional pilot performance looks like." The recognition felt different from the institutional acknowledgments she'd received for her symbolic importance.
This was validation from peers who cared only about combat effectiveness, pilots whose own lives might someday depend on her skills and judgment. As the squadron debriefed the exercise, Sarah found herself in the unexpected position of leading discussions about advanced tactics and physiological management during high-G maneuvering. Her experience with motion tolerance had given her insights that benefited pilots who'd never struggled with vestibular challenges. The key, she explained to a group of younger pilots, is treating your body's responses as flight instruments rather than distractions. When you feel disorientation beginning, that's information about your aircraft's attitude and energy state. When you experience G-induced tunnel vision, that's feedback about your tactical situation and the need to adjust your approach. Lieutenant David Park, the squadron commander's son and a recent pilot training graduate, raised his hand with a question that revealed how much thinking about pilot development had evolved. "Ma'am, the new motion tolerance training we received was based on your experience. How do we know when we're pushing our physiological limits versus when we're just uncomfortable?" Sarah's answer drew on months of research and experimentation that had followed her initial breakthrough. The human body is remarkably adaptable, but it requires trust and communication. If you fight your physiological responses, they become limitations. If you work with them, they become capabilities. The discussion continued for 2 hours, with pilots sharing experiences and techniques that had emerged from the new approach to vestibular training. Sarah realized that her former struggle had evolved into expertise, that her journey from excluded candidate to exceptional pilot had created knowledge that enhanced the entire squadron's effectiveness. 6 months into her fighter training, Sarah received notification that she'd been selected for NASA's astronaut candidate program. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered with the routine efficiency that characterized all military correspondence, but its contents represented the culmination of a journey that had begun with
"Congratulations, Lieutenant Chen," Lieutenant Colonel Park said when she reported the news. "Your selection represents not just individual achievement, but validation of our belief that excellence can emerge from unexpected sources." The squadron's celebration that evening felt like a family gathering, with pilots who'd become more than colleagues sharing in her success. Sarah understood that her achievement reflected not just her own persistence, but the support she'd received from mentors who'd believed in developing talent rather than excluding it. As she prepared to transition from fighter pilot to astronaut candidate, Sarah reflected on the transformation that had brought her to this moment. She'd entered pilot training as someone struggling to overcome a physiological limitation that threatened to end her dreams before they began. She was leaving as someone whose struggle had become a strength, whose journey had opened doors for others, whose success had proven that barriers could become stepping stones. The night before departing for NASA, Sarah stood once more on the flight line, watching F-35s return from night training missions. Their navigation lights traced elegant patterns against the desert sky, modern constellations that reminded her of humanity's eternal desire to slip the bonds of Earth and touch the face of the infinite. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that persistence and proper support could overcome any obstacle. But tonight, Second Lieutenant Sarah Chen fell asleep as someone who'd learned that the most important victories weren't just personal. They were the ones that made victory possible for everyone who followed. Her motion sickness had become a catalyst for institutional change. Her struggles had illuminated systematic problems that affected countless other aviators. Her success had proven that with proper support and evaluation, barriers that seemed insurmountable could become launching pads for excellence. 3 years later, the International Space Station hung against the star-studded void like a technological cathedral, its solar arrays catching the light of an Earthrise that painted the cosmos in shades of blue and gold. Inside the cupola observation module, mission specialist Sarah Chen floated in perfect weightlessness, her body finally at peace with the absence of gravity that had once seemed like an impossible dream.
Below her, Earth turned with majestic silence, its weather system swirling across continents with patterns that revealed the planet's breathtaking complexity. Sarah had been aboard the station for 4 months, but the view never lost its power to humble and inspire. Each sunrise brought 16 sunrises in a 24-hour period, a reminder of humanity's tenuous but determined reach into the infinite. "Chen, how copy for EVA prep?" The voice belonged to Commander Lisa Rodriguez, the station's commanding officer and Sarah's mentor in the peculiar art of living and working in microgravity. "Copy, Commander," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. Today's spacewalk would be her third, but each venture outside the station's protective hull brought new challenges and revelations. As Sarah prepared for the EVA, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment, floating 250 miles above Earth. The motion sickness that had once threatened to end her aviation career had become her greatest asset in space, where traditional concepts of up and down dissolved into fluid adaptability. NASA's selection process revealed that her unique relationship with vestibular challenges made her exceptionally suited for long-duration spaceflight. While other astronauts struggled with space adaptation syndrome, Sarah's body embraced microgravity with an ease that astonished flight surgeons and mission planners alike.
"Hi, astronaut Sarah," the chorus of young voices carried across 250 miles of space with crystal clarity. "We're studying motion and forces in science class, and our teacher said you used to get motion sickness." Sarah smiled, remembering her own childhood fascination with aircraft and space travel. "That's right. I used to get very sick when I moved in certain ways, especially in airplanes. But I learned that sometimes our challenges can become our greatest strengths." A young girl's voice rose above the others. "How did motion sickness help you become an astronaut?" The question went to the heart of Sarah's transformation, the journey from struggling pilot candidate to space station crew member. "Well, when you have motion sickness, you learn to pay very close attention to how your body feels when it moves. In space, where there's no gravity, that skill becomes really important for moving around safely." The conversation continued for 30 minutes, with Sarah demonstrating how astronauts moved in microgravity while explaining the science behind orbital mechanics and human adaptation to space. Each question reminded her of her own childhood curiosity, the wonder that had driven her to persist through every obstacle. After the education event, Sarah made her way to the station's laboratory module, where she was conducting research that combined her engineering background with her unique insights into vestibular adaptation. Her experiment was studying how the human brain adapted to conflicting sensory inputs in microgravity, work that could improve training for future astronauts and help people with balance disorders on Earth. The irony wasn't lost on her that the motion sickness, which had once been seen as a disqualifying weakness, was now the foundation of groundbreaking research that could benefit millions of people. Her personal struggle had become scientific insight, her limitation transformed into contribution. "Dr. Chen," called flight engineer Yuki Tanaka, using the title Sarah had earned through her doctorate in aerospace medicine, completed during her astronaut training. "The latest data from your vestibular research is showing remarkable results." Sarah floated over to review the experimental data, her movements in microgravity as natural as walking had once been on Earth. The research was revealing new understanding about how the human brain processed spatial information, insights that emerged directly from her own experience with motion challenges. "Yuki, these results could revolutionize how we prepare astronauts for long-duration missions," Sarah said, studying patterns in the data that confirmed her hypotheses about vestibular adaptation. The research had applications far beyond spaceflight. Physical therapists were using Sarah's techniques to help stroke patients recover balance. Pilots were learning new approaches to managing spatial disorientation. Even amusement park designers were consulting her work to create rides that were thrilling without being nauseating. As Sarah prepared for her EVA, she received a personal communication from Earth that reminded her of how far her influence had spread. The message was from Lieutenant Colonel Carmen Martinez, her former roommate who now commanded a pilot training squadron. "Sarah," Carmen's voice carried across the void with the warmth of enduring friendship, "I wanted you to know that our squadron just graduated its most diverse class in Air Force history. 53% women, 37% minorities, and a 100% success rate in overcoming initial challenges through the support protocols your experience helped establish." The statistics represented more than numbers. They were human stories of dreams achieved, barriers overcome, potential realized. Sarah's individual journey had become institutional knowledge.
Transformation. Her struggle, the catalyst for systematic change that was still creating opportunities years later. The motion tolerance training you pioneered is now standard curriculum across all military pilot training programs, Carmen continued. We're graduating pilots who see physiological challenges as information rather than limitations. Your legacy is living in every cockpit, every squadron, every mission we fly. Sarah felt a profound satisfaction that came from knowing her struggles had meaning beyond personal achievement. The vomit-stained tarmac where her career had nearly ended had become the foundation for systematic changes that were still opening doors for qualified candidates who might otherwise have been excluded. During the EVA, as Sarah worked outside the station in the absolute silence of space, she thought about her grandfather's influence on her journey. James Chen's pilot wings, which she'd carried through every phase of her career, were now aboard the space station as a reminder of the continuity between generations of aviators and explorers. The Earth turned below her with hypnotic beauty, its thin atmosphere the only barrier between human civilization and the infinite cosmos. Sarah performed her assigned tasks with the precision that had carried her from struggling cadet to space station crew member. But part of her attention was always focused on the broader perspective that spaceflight provided. From 250 miles above Earth, the barriers that divided people seemed artificial and temporary. National boundaries disappeared into the flowing patterns of weather and ocean currents. The challenges that had once seemed insurmountable, motion sickness, institutional bias, the physics of human spaceflight, revealed themselves as temporary obstacles rather than permanent limitations. "Sarah, beautiful work out there," Commander Rodriguez transmitted as the EVA concluded. "Your efficiency and precision continue to set new standards for spacewalk operations." The praise reflected not just technical competence, but the transformation that had carried Sarah from someone whose body betrayed her dreams to someone whose unique relationship with motion made her exceptionally suited for humanity's greatest adventure. 5 years later, the auditorium at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on monitors throughout the building. Dr. Sarah Chen, now a veteran of 3 space station missions and commander of the upcoming Mars mission, stood before an audience that included everyone from elementary school students to senior government officials. "When I was 8 years old," Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd literally reached for the stars, "I stood in this very museum looking up at the Apollo command module and dreaming of spaceflight. But I also got motion sick on the metro ride here, and my mom had to carry plastic bags in case I needed them." The audience laughed, understanding the irony of someone whose motion sickness had nearly prevented her from becoming one of humanity's most accomplished astronauts. Today, I want to talk to you about the power of reframing our limitations as information, our struggles as preparation, our obstacles as stepping stones to achievements we never thought possible. Sarah's presentation drew on a decade of experience that had taken her from struggling pilot candidate to space explorer, from someone fighting for acceptance to someone whose success had transformed entire institutions.
Her story had become a case study in human adaptability, organizational change, and the importance of supporting potential rather than excluding it. In the front row sat General Patricia Hammond, now retired but still an influential voice in military aviation policy. Beside her were Colonel Webb and Captain Morrison, both of whom had played crucial roles in Sarah's early development as a pilot. Their presence reminded Sarah of the mentors who'd believed in her potential when others saw only limitations.
The presentation included video footage from her spacewalks, her research aboard the International Space Station, and her preparation for the Mars mission that would launch in 18 months. Each image represented not just personal achievement, but the culmination of institutional changes that had created opportunities for countless others. During the question and answer session, a young girl raised her hand with the kind of earnest curiosity that reminded Sarah of her own childhood wonder. "Dr. Chen, I get really dizzy on playground equipment, and my teacher says I might not be able to be a pilot. But you got motion sick and you're going to Mars. How do I know if I can do it too?" Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with questions that went to the heart of her mission as an educator and advocate. The most important thing to remember is that your body's responses are information, not limitations. If you want to be a pilot or an astronaut, find people who will help you understand what your body is trying to tell you, rather than people who use those responses as reasons you can't succeed. The girl's face lit up with possibility, and Sarah saw in her expression the same determination that had carried her through every challenge of her own journey. After the presentation, Sarah was approached by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, now the director of NASA's astronaut training program and still a close friend from their days navigating institutional bias together. "Sarah," Jennifer said, "I have news about the pilot training metrics we've been tracking since your case catalyzed the policy changes." Sarah listened as Jennifer shared statistics that represented the human impact of institutional transformation. Success rates for female pilot candidates had increased by 47%. Minority representation in combat aviation had doubled. Most remarkably, the overall quality of graduating pilots had improved as instructors learned to develop struggling candidates rather than eliminate them. "Your motion sickness didn't just change your life," Jennifer explained. "It changed how we think about human potential in the most demanding environments. The training protocols you helped develop are now being used by space agencies around the world." As the evening concluded, Sarah made her way to the museum's Apollo 11 exhibit, the same display that had inspired her childhood dreams. But now she stood before it not as someone reaching for impossible goals, but as someone preparing to take the next great leap in human exploration. Her phone buzzed with a message from her current crew, fellow Mars mission astronauts who were completing their final training preparations. The team represented the diversity that had become possible through the changes Sarah's journey had catalyzed. 2 women, 1 minority pilot whose grandfather had been told he wasn't intellectually suited for military aviation, and a former Air Force cadet who'd overcome a traumatic brain injury that had initially disqualified him from spaceflight. "Commander Chen," the message read, "final simulations complete. The crew is ready to make history. Thanks for proving that limitations are just starting points for excellence."
Sarah smiled, thinking about the 18-month journey to Mars that lay ahead. The mission would test human endurance and adaptability in ways that no previous space mission had attempted. Her crew would face psychological challenges, physiological stress, and technical problems that would require the kind of innovative thinking that emerged from overcoming obstacles rather than avoiding them. As Sarah walked through the museum's halls, past displays celebrating aviation and space exploration pioneers, she thought about the letters she still received from young people inspired by her story. Each message reminded her that her individual journey had become something larger, proof that persistence, proper support, and the courage to reframe limitations could create possibilities that seemed impossible. A recent letter from a 12-year-old named Maya had particularly moved her. "Dr. Chen, I have dyslexia and my teacher said I might not be smart enough for science, but your story taught me that different brains might be exactly what space exploration needs. I'm going to study really hard and maybe someday I'll work on the Mars colony you're helping to establish." These were the victories that mattered most, not the personal achievements or institutional recognition, but the dreams that her success had made possible for others. Every young person who refused to accept limitations, every instructor who chose development over elimination, every organization that embraced diversity as strength rather than viewing it as a burden, carried forward the legacy of that vomit-stained tarmac where her transformation had begun. Outside the museum, Sarah looked up at the evening sky where Mars appeared as a red dot among the stars. In 18 months, she would be there, commanding humanity's first long-duration mission to another planet. The journey would take 9 months each way, with 18 months on the Martian surface, a test of human adaptability that would dwarf anything attempted before. Her crew had been selected not just for their technical competence, but for their diverse approaches to problem-solving, their demonstrated ability to overcome challenges, and their capacity to support each other through the inevitable difficulties of interplanetary exploration. They represented the best of human potential, chosen through evaluation processes that Sarah's own experience had helped revolutionize. The next morning brought final mission preparations that would occupy Sarah's attention for the coming months, but she began each day the same way she had since pilot training, touching her grandfather's wings, now destined to become the first military aviation insignia to reach Mars. James Chen's legacy had evolved from individual service to institutional transformation to interplanetary exploration. His granddaughter's motion sickness had become humanity's ticket to the stars, proof that the characteristics which seem to disqualify us from our dreams might actually be the very qualities that enable us to achieve them. As Sarah prepared for humanity's greatest adventure, she carried with her the knowledge that excellence wasn't about avoiding challenges, but about transforming them into capabilities. Her motion sickness had taught her to listen to her body's signals, to adapt to disorienting environments, to find strength in what others saw as weakness. The young woman who had once vomited on a Nevada tarmac while her dreams seemed to crumble around her was now preparing to plant humanity's flag on another world. Her journey proved that with persistence, proper support, and the courage to reframe our limitations, we could reach beyond any barrier that tried to contain our potential. In 18 months, when Sarah Chen's spacecraft departed Earth for Mars, it would carry more than scientific instruments and survival equipment. It would carry the dreams of everyone who'd been told they weren't good enough, smart enough, or strong enough to achieve the impossible. Her motion sickness had become humanity's motion towards the stars.